All right. Awesome. We see a lot of people joining. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Okay, we're gonna let the attendees file in a little bit more, give it a minute or two, and then we'll get started today. In the meantime, while we're doing that, let us know where you are Zooming in from around the world. We have a lot of people usually from all over. Would love to know where everybody is coming from. Toronto, SoCal up in the house, Brazil, awesome, Mexico, LA, France, Australia, South Africa, Madrid, Puerto Rico. Awesome. Boston. Very cool. Welcome so much. Welcome, welcome. Yes, recording will be sent to all attendees. Barcelona, Chile. Very cool. Well, welcome everybody. This is we're very happy to have you here. We'll give it about 30 more seconds, let people file in, and then we'll get going. All right. All righty, let's get started. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Rebecca Zabarski, and I'm the Director of Marketing at Parrot Analytics, where we help the entertainment industry understand global audience demand in today's attention economy. Parrot Analytics Live is our thought leadership webinar series that features industry experts translating the trends and analytics that we see at Parrot Analytics. I want to give a special welcome to our Demand 360 Light and Enterprise partners who are here today. Hello, we are thrilled to have you join us. And we also know that so many of you are joining from far away, so it might be late or really early. Thank you for spending your time with us. We really appreciate that. Today is a special event because we have the author of our annual Global TV Demand Report here with us, Chris. Hi. He's going to be offering up the top takeaways from that report. And the Global TV Demand Report is sort of a state of the industry report. We publish this every quarter and at the end of the year to highlight the worldwide demand of digital originals in multiple markets and on a global basis. So you can get access to the report by signing up for Demand 360. And if you're not already a subscriber, if you stick around to the end of the webinar, I'll be sharing a special offer in the chat for you to get discounted access. That's the only way that you can get access to the report itself. We have a few minutes at the end of the call where Chris will be answering questions that you submitted when you signed up for the webinar. And if we don't get to those, I will, I'll be manning the chat. So I'll be around sending, answering any kind of questions and also just taking note of your questions if we don't get to those. And we'll follow up later. So now I'm going to disappear and hand it over to Chris. He's our Senior Insights Analyst and the author of the Global TV Demand Report. Chris, go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. And thanks everyone for showing up today. So another year's behind us, and I'm really excited to be sharing some of the findings from our 2021 Global TV Demand Report. And for those of you who've been regulars over the past few years, you'll know what the content of these reports looks like. But just as a reminder, this report covers global demand for digital original series in 2021, globally and in 10 specific markets. And this webinar is going to look a bit different from previous ones. I'll be focusing more on the global data and a few key trends we've pulled out that we've seen over the past year. And we're going to make sure we have time for questions at the end. All right, so let's hop into it. It's always nice to have a high-level takeaway. So we're going to be starting with a global view of things. And I want to begin by looking back at last year. So this is where we stood in 2020 in terms of the global demand share for original series of these platforms. So major takeaways: Netflix still had a majority of demand for original series globally. Behind it was Amazon Prime Video with about 12% share, and behind Amazon Hulu. And that was a pretty consistent pattern that we'd seen for years. But new in 2020 were these three new platforms. So Disney Plus, HBO Max, Apple TV Plus. And we saw them in 2020 starting to carve out a bit of a demand share for themselves here. Now, fast forward to this year, and you can see that the landscape has changed quite a bit. So major takeaway, Netflix fell below a 50% share of demand for original series globally for the first time in 2021. And of course, that didn't happen overnight. That's been a long-term trend we were seeing, but they've finally fallen below that threshold. Other major takeaways, Disney Plus was the biggest gainer of the year, more than doubling its demand share to 7.4% in 2021 globally. So it's really had an amazing year, no surprise. Apple TV Plus, we've also seen gaining demand share this year. It's at 5.8% in 2021. One thing I'll also mention, you'll notice Paramount Plus has rebranded in 2021. So like that's a minor notational change we saw. And also key to point out, we saw Disney Plus and Apple TV Plus leapfrogging Hulu. So Hulu had been in that third place position behind Amazon Prime Video for a long time, but now it's been overtaken by these newer platforms. So we really see these new entrants to the market shaking up the space. And I'll also say that Amazon Prime Video has done a really good job of fending off the competition, holding pretty steady around a 12% share year on year. So it's done a good job of defending its demand share. So that was a snapshot at one point in time. This chart I love because it looks at how the demand share for these platforms has shifted every quarter over the last 2 years. So you can really see how dynamic it's been, the changes that have been happening. And I'll draw your attention first to Netflix, the red bars. You can see globally, their share of demand has declined every quarter over the past 2 years. They haven't actually managed to grow their demand share. At best, they've held steady. So that's really a long-term trend we've been seeing, and it's now a question of when are they going to bottom out, really. Next, if you look at Disney Plus, you can really see that they've been one of the fastest growers over the last 2 years. So a really huge increase in their demand share. But I do want to point out that actually in Q4 2021, their global share of demand shrank slightly. So it hasn't been totally consistent growth for Disney Plus. And a nice contrast to that is Apple TV Plus. They've had really consistent growth every quarter since mid-2020. And the way they've done that is by having high quality original series constantly coming out. So if you compare the two, it's interesting because Disney Plus is more hit driven. So when they have a major hit, like any of their Marvel series, The Mandalorian, for example, that can really spike their demand share. But if they go a quarter or a month without a hit, then they are at risk of losing share. So I think those two are an interesting comparison. Right, so those are some high-level views. Now I wanted to focus on which shows were the most in-demand series for 2021 by market. I think we see a few interesting trends coming in here. So starting off, we have The Mandalorian was the most in-demand digital original series in 2021 in 4 markets in this report: Canada, UK, Germany, and Australia. And this show started off 2021 on a high note. It just wrapped up a really successful season 2. And I don't want to give any spoilers away, but I'll just mention that at the end of this past year, 2021, the Book of Boba Fett premiered, and there were some major tie-ins with The Mandalorian there. And it's interesting to see how these integrated series having an integrated series like the Book of Boba Fett has lifted demand for The Mandalorian as well. So it's kept it at the top of people's minds. And it's just an example of how Disney Plus has done a great job building these integrated universes. I also mentioned with Canada and Germany, there's a larger love of sci-fi that's at play here. So it's not just The Mandalorian, it's not just Star Wars that's succeeding in these markets. We also see Star Trek doing very well in these 2 countries and other sci-fi series. Next, we have La Casa de Papel. La Casa de Papel was the most in-demand digital original series in 3 markets in this report. No surprise, it's the top show in Spain for the year, its home market. But it's also interesting to see that this is the most in-demand original series in France and Italy as well. So a bit of regional trend coming through there in Romance-speaking Europe. And La Casa de Papel has been really interesting to watch its trajectory over the past few years. Of course, this year it had its series finale, so it wrapped up finally. But back when it first began in Spain, before being acquired by Netflix, it was really only hugely in demand in Spain. And then, of course, coming Netflix, it blew up globally. But Spain pretty much stayed the market that had the highest demand for this show. And really this year, we actually saw India had higher demand for La Casa de Papel than Spain on a per capita basis. So really great story of this series becoming a global hit. So that's been fun to watch. Next up, we have WandaVision. So WandaVision was the most in-demand original series in Brazil and Mexico, the two Latin American markets we looked at in this report. Again, some larger trends coming through here. Superhero series have done very well in Latin America, not just Marvel. We also see some shows from HBO Max really succeeding in these markets. And WandaVision, again, is also a great example of how these tightly connected universes can keep a show in demand even after it's wrapped up. So WandaVision was the first of the new Marvel series premiere at the beginning of the year. And with subsequent Marvel series premiering, that kept it relevant and at the top of audiences' minds. So it had a successful year. And finally, in the US was unique in this report with Stranger Things as its most in-demand digital original for the year. And obviously this is a globally popular show, but we do see it continuing to have uniquely high demand with American audiences. So it's really resonating with its home market. And I'll just pause and say that these are the 10 markets we cover in this report. So we'll be getting a little bit more into them later. So from what we just saw, you'll notice that none of those shows except WandaVision were new premieres last year. And that's really why I wanted to focus on the shows over the past year that have had the most successful new premieres. So what are we looking at here? These are series that have newly premiered in 2021, and we're comparing demand in their first 30 days to get a sense of which series had the most successful premiere. And I love this chart because of the underdog upset that we can see. So if you've been following digital original series over 2021, you probably may have felt that Disney Plus had this in the bag. Of course, it had these major hits coming out this year. It really saw explosive growth in its demand share. So it almost felt like that was written in stone. But then along comes Squid Game in October, and out of nowhere, surprises everyone and actually has a more successful series premiere than WandaVision, for example, by the slimmest of margins too. So that's what makes it a great story. So Squid Game was the most in-demand new series premiere of the year. And in its first 30 days, it had 84.4 times the average series demand. WandaVision just had 84.0. One more thing I'll point out, if you're looking at these series, you may notice that most of them are based on some sort of existing intellectual property. So whether that's being part of the Marvel universe, like these 4 Marvel premieres, being part of the Star Wars universe, like the Book of Boba Fett, more traditional based on a book like Foundation, The Wheel of Time. Arcane's interesting because it's based on a video game. So that's an interesting sign of where you can find IP to base shows on. But Squid Game's unique in that it's not based on existing IP. So that makes its win all the more impressive. It didn't have those built-in advantages of an existing fan base. It really came out of nowhere and surprised everyone. And another thing I did want to highlight here. So if you're looking at just the Marvel series, they've had declining demand for their premieres over the course of the year as new series have premiered. Each new Marvel series has had a less successful premiere, less demand in its first 30 days. I think this might point to an example of franchise fatigue. So obviously Disney Plus has had a hugely successful year. They've just rolled out the hits one right after the other, but one risk with that is that you might be stretching the Marvel fan base increasingly thinly. And I think that might be what's coming into play here with these increasingly less successful global premieres. So I wanted to broaden this and look at the top 20 series premieres of the year. And we actually don't cover this in the report, but I wanted to show you here today because I think there's some interesting takeaways when you look at the top 20. So first off, I want to highlight how Korean dramas have really been trending this year. They've been on the rise. Of course, Squid Game is the best example of that as the most in-demand new series premiere of the year. But when we look in the top 20 series premieres, we also see The Silent Sea is there, Hellbound. These are all from Netflix. And we've been tracking increasing demand for Korean content for years now, basically since 2019. Specifically in the US, we saw an increase in interest following the movie Parasite's success. So it's been trending upward for a while now, but it really feels like 2021, we reached critical mass for demand for Korean content globally. And we see that with these hugely in demand series premieres. And as I mentioned, they're all from Netflix. So Netflix is really leading the charge here. And I thought an interesting point of comparison was looking back at one of Netflix's earlier K-dramas, Kingdom, to compare to these. So Kingdom, when it first premiered season one in 2019, globally it had about 10 times the average series demand in its first season. So it was doing well, but nowhere on par with these shows. And season 2, it finally had global demand in the mid 20 times the average series demand. So we see audiences discovering that show over time, it becoming successful, but it takes time. That's not the case with these new K-dramas. They're immediately successful. They have huge demand in their first 30 days. It's not taking audiences time to discover these. So I think that's a really good sign that Korean dramas have reached a level of mainstream global popularity. And one more I want to highlight. So this actually isn't in the report because it's brand new this year. So it doesn't feature in the report's data, but we just got a demand for All of Us Are Dead in its first 30 days. And in its first 30 days, it had 60 times the average series demand, which is really phenomenal. That puts it ahead of The Silent Sea, ahead of Hellbound. It's also from Netflix. One really impressive thing when you look at this, so 60 times the average series demand, that would actually put it ahead of Boba Fett's premiere, which is amazing that a K-drama from Netflix can have a more successful premiere globally than a new series in the Star Wars universe. So another great indicator that Korean drama is trending upward. So next, I wanted to focus on a few key genres we've been following over the past year and how they've been trending. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a bit of a different format for those of you who've been regulars. Rather than picking a few specific countries to do deep dives in, we're just going to keep it high-level global trends. So first, I want to take a look at documentaries. We see that there was a surge in demand for documentaries throughout 2020. This is when the most growth for the genre occurred. Of course, shows like Tiger King, shows like The Last Dance were really driving increasing global demand for the genre. But 2021, demand for documentaries globally has kind of flatlined. It's leveled off. So we haven't seen the same growth we saw in 2020. But I will say that the genre has maintained its gains that it made in 2020. It's held pretty steady. So it hasn't fallen back. It's held on to its growth. And when we specifically look at how digital original documentaries have been doing compared to all documentary series, we do see them continuing to grow, especially towards the end of the year, hitting new highs. And this map is looking at which countries have the most demand for documentary series. So this is the share of demand for digital original documentaries in each country. Across the world, these countries saw growth in demand for documentary series in 2020, and it's kind of leveled off in 2021. And I'll say that the US is still the most documentary obsessed country in this report. Over 10% of demand for digital original series was for a documentary in the US this year. And if you look compared to other countries that we covered, that's a significantly higher number. So digging into the US a bit more, so here we have the most in-demand digital original subgenres for the year. And I really love this chart because it just gives a taste of what specific types of content are succeeding in a market for the year. So the US has a huge variety of subgenres that are doing well: action, comedy, drama, kids, animation. But the US was unique in this report, is the only market that had a documentary subgenre in its top 10. So that's true crime. So true crime was the most in-demand documentary subgenre for the year in the US and in most countries, but it made it into the top 10 in the US. And I'm going to look at a few examples of shows that have been influenced by documentaries and true crime specifically. So we've seen demand for documentaries leveling off this year, but I think what's happened to the trend is that documentaries have become so popular that they're beginning to influence other types of content. So here's one example. I picked Dr. Death. This is based on true crime podcast. And this isn't a documentary in and of itself. It's a highly dramatized version of the story from this true crime podcast. So I think it's just a great example of how documentaries have reached a level of popularity and are influencing other types of content. And another great example of how podcasts can serve as a source of IP to make successful shows. Next, I love this example personally. I watched the series and I thought it was great, but Only Murders in the Building is this interesting amalgamation of a murder mystery, comedy drama spoof of the true crime genre. And I think it's a good sign that a genre has reached a level of mainstream acceptance when there's a comedy drama spoof of the genre that stars Steve Martin, Martin Short, and Selena Gomez. So I think that's an interesting indicator. And we see that its peak demand in the US was 37 times the average series demand. So it's done really well this past year. And it was one of these shows that helped Hulu grow its demand share a bit at the end of the year. And this hasn't been isolated to 2021. We see this continuing into this year. So I just picked two recent series, Pam and Tommy from Hulu and Inventing Anna. So again, these aren't documentaries, but these are highly dramatized stories based on a true crime event, a real story. So, and what's interesting about these two series is they're both based on articles that were chronicling this crime. So again, an interesting example of where you can find source material for shows. And actually, it just occurred to me today that there's another great example of this new show from Hulu, The Dropout, and that's premiering today. That's about Elizabeth Holmes and the Theranos scandal. But again, it's a highly dramatized telling of the story. It's not a documentary per se, but it is based on podcasts that covered that story. So one more great example, premiering today. So we don't even have data on it yet, but we're going to be following it closely for sure. So those were documentaries. Now I want to take a look at animation, and animation has seen consistently growing demand over the past 2 years. It hasn't leveled off like documentaries. It's been continuing to grow over 2 years, its demand globally. Specifically, if we look at where it was at the end of 2021, it was almost twice, the demand for animated series was almost twice what it was in January 2020. So like that's some really impressive growth. And specifically, when we break out demand for digital original animation, we see that digital original animated series have been driving the growth in 2021 specifically. So a lot of new series driving growing demand for animation there. And what countries are demanding animation? So across the board, in all the markets we looked at, we've seen a growing share of demand for animated original content, but specifically in Mexico and Brazil, these countries had the highest demand. So a little bit of regional preference there. And I want to focus on Mexico a bit. It had the highest share of demand for animated content. 8.3% of demand for digital original series was for an animated series. And I'm going to dig in a bit to what's driving the growing demand for animation. So first off, I want to highlight that we've seen booming global demand for anime and anime-inspired content. And just as a reminder, fans of anime are not just in Japan anymore. So I picked these two shows. They're both Netflix originals. First, we have Record of Ragnarok that premiered this year and actually ranked higher in Mexico than any of the markets we looked at. So we see some market-specific interest in anime coming through there. And then we also have Castlevania. And Castlevania's been around for a few years. It had its series finale this year. And it hasn't just succeeded in Mexico, it's been successful around the world. So gained a level of mainstream acceptance. And I think it's interesting and kind of analogous to what Netflix has done with Korean dramas, sort of bringing them to global audiences, helping them reach a level of mainstream appeal. We can see it also doing that with anime as well. Next, I want to highlight high demand for action animation. So this is interesting because it combines two popular genres, action adventure and animation. And specifically with Mexico, we know Mexico has high demand for superhero series as well as animated content. So shows like Invincible that lie at the intersection of these two do really well here. And it's not just Mexico we see this. Other countries that may have really high demand for action content, but not as high demand for animation content, we see action animated content succeeding in those markets as well. So I think it's an example of how animation can help meet really high demand for action content. whether that's superhero series like Invincible or other action animation content. Even you could argue anime is doing that as well. And finally, I want to point out how anime is being used to build out franchises. And here I picked Star Wars: The Bad Batch as an example. It ranked higher in Mexico for the past year, had 13 times the average series demand, premiered in 2021. But we don't just see Star Wars doing this. We see Star Trek, Marvel, DC also building out their universes with animated content. Star Trek has Star Trek Lower Decks, which is an animated comedy. Also has Star Trek Prodigy, which is more of a kid's show. Marvel obviously has Marvel's What If. DC has Harley Quinn. But these are all just examples of how a large universe with strong live action series can build out its universe with animated series as well. And I think Star Wars is a great example because of how the animated series have been connected into the broader universe. We even see characters crossing over between animated series and live action series, and that's really succeeded for Star Wars and Disney Plus in specific. So those are some high-level global trends, and because we're not going to get into any market-specific deep dives, I did want to just touch on unique market-specific preferences today. So I'm going to go through kind of rapid fire and just give you a top-level takeaway for each country, what made them unique in this report. So some markets distinguish themselves in terms of high demand for a specific genre. So here we see Spain had the highest share of demand for dramas of markets we looked at, and that's driven in part by Netflix having some really popular Spanish dramas. Think La Casa de Papel, think Elite, but we also see some Spanish platforms having really popular dramas in the market too. So that's helping drive high demand for drama in Spain. Canada's interesting. It had the highest share of demand for comedies in 2021, and that's a first because the US has traditionally had the highest share of demand for a comedy series. So 2021 was the first year that Canada overtook it, and that's because of few series that had uniquely high demand in Canada. So Canada was our comedy loving market this year. The US has extremely high demand for reality series, has by far the largest share of demand for reality content in this report, much larger than other countries. And I think part of the driver there might be supply. So we just see a larger number of digital original reality series local to the US than in other markets. So I think that's part of the driver for high demand for reality there. And in Brazil was our horror loving market for the year. Horror, of course, is a much smaller genre than these others, but Brazil had the largest share of demand for horror content. And if those countries were unique in their high demand for a genre, some countries are unique in low demand for a genre. So I just pulled out France as an example. They had the lowest share of demand for comedy series. We really see comedies not doing as well in that market as other places. So I think that's the takeaway there. And with a few countries, you have to dig a little deeper to find a market-specific taste. So Mexico, I mentioned earlier, really high demand for superhero series. Superhero series are successful mostly everywhere. I think in a majority of markets in this report, superhero series was the most in-demand subgenre. But specifically in Mexico, it had the greatest lead over the second most in-demand subgenre. So huge demand for superhero series in Mexico. Germany's interesting. So I flagged as having high demand for outer space themed content. And at the beginning, I mentioned The Mandalorian was the most in-demand digital original series for the year in Germany. But we also see consistently high demand for the Star Trek franchise there. We see that The Expanse has succeeded in Germany. And now those are all sci-fi series that deal with outer space. But I also noticed that For All Mankind has ranked higher in Germany than any other market in this report. And that's an interesting example because that isn't really sci-fi, that's much more grounded in reality. If you're familiar with the series, it's a reimagining of what the space race could look like. So it's almost a historical drama about the space race, but an alternate history. So it isn't just sci-fi series succeeding in Germany, it's series with outer space themes. And we have a few markets that are unique in terms of high demand for content from a specific platform. So Italy had the greatest share of demand for Netflix originals this year. In fact, it was the only market in this report where Netflix was still clinging on to a larger than 50% share of demand. So it's held up better in Italy than in other places. And part of the reason for that is Netflix has put out a number of Italian language originals. So that's helped them guard their demand share in Italy. And we see Apple TV Plus succeeding in Australia. Australia had the largest share of demand for Apple TV Plus originals of any market we looked at. And a few series in particular are succeeding in Australia from Apple TV Plus. For example, Ted Lasso, that's huge there. So that's helping to drive high demand share for the platform in Australia. Now, the UK was interesting because it was a bit tricky to find a unique market taste for the UK. Its genre preferences were pretty middle of the road. Nothing veered too far from the average. The closest it had to a unique market preference was high demand for documentaries, but the US had a higher share of demand for documentaries. So that didn't make it unique in this report. So I had to do a bit of digging to find a unique market taste for the UK. And that unique preference is for Jeremy Clarkson, for himself as talent and for shows that he's in. So I noticed a few series starring him have done really well in the UK. Of course, Grand Tour has been around for a few years. It's been globally successful, but in particular in the UK. And Clarkson's Farm just premiered this year, had peak demand of 14.7 times the average series in the UK for the year. So it's had a really successful series premiere. Specifically in the UK, these are both Amazon Prime originals. And I just think they're a great example of how you can leverage locally popular talent to make series successful. So Amazon's done a good job of that. And specifically, we can look at talent demand for Jeremy Clarkson. And it's interesting because you see that he's uniquely popular in the UK. For the year, he had 8.5 times the average talent demand in the UK. That was much higher than anywhere else in the world. So he's really uniquely popular in his home market. And I think that's part of the reason for the success of these series we saw from Amazon Prime Video. So that's all I've prepared for today. And I'll just mention, if you want a deep dive on these 10 markets and fuller commentary on the trends over the past year, you can get the full report on our platform, Demand 360. So if you just give me a minute, I'll see if any questions have come in. I know some people submitted some questions ahead of time, so I have those, but I'm just going to check and see if anyone has any questions for today. Just a minute. So I'll start with one of the questions that was asked in advance. So we had one person ask about trends for India, and India was not a market we covered in this annual report, but we have looked at it in previous quarterly reports, and it's a really exciting growth market that we've been following for a while. So I did pull some data on India that I'll share now. So India was unique in terms of the subgenres of content that it had high demand for. So the most in-demand subgenre in India for the past year was crime drama. And none of the 10 markets we looked at in this report had crime drama as their top subgenre for the year. It was split between superhero series and sci-fi dramas. Those two subgenres don't do as well in India. The second most in-demand subgenre was thrillers. So we don't see as high demand for sci-fi dramas in India, which is an interesting, unique market taste there. I'll share that the most in-demand series for the year was Mirzapur. That's from Amazon Prime Video. The second most in-demand digital original series for the year was La Casa de Papel. I mentioned that before. It's really seen huge growth in demand in India, which has been interesting to follow. Amazon has a particularly high share of demand in the Indian market, and that's because they've made a lot of local originals. So Mirzapur, for example, the top original series of the year, but also shows like The Family Man and other series. And also unique to India, it has a number of local platforms making highly in-demand original content. So platforms like Hotstar, Z5, Voot. So all of these platforms are competing, carving out a share of demand. So it's a highly competitive market. There's a lot going on there. So we received a number of questions in advance that were kind of along the same theme. So I've grouped them up into this theme. I grouped them into two themes, actually. So a number of questions came in about local versus global content, which is more important to focus on, which is going to be more important for streamers to focus their energies on. And I'm hoping that you've seen in this report that a local versus global content is a bit of a false dichotomy. With shows like Squid Game, shows like La Casa de Papel, I think really the most successful globally minded streamers are going to make local content that appeals to a specific audience, but then also turn it into a global hit. So if we were to look at Netflix's demand share in Korea, it's doing really well there because it's made a number of Korean dramas, but it's also taken these Korean dramas, and as we've seen with Squid Game and those other examples I provided earlier, these have become globally popular. So local versus global content is becoming a bit of a false dichotomy, and I think the most successful streamers are going to realize that you can have your cake and eat it too. Oh, great. I see a question came in about the impact of local originals, so I just touched on that, so that's great. One other theme of questions that has come in is around, is it more important to have a variety of different kinds of content or quality content? So I thought of this question in terms of, it's in some ways a quality versus quantity question. And for me, the answer to this is it definitely depends. For streamers, it's going to depend on what your objective is and what stage of growth you're at. So I think back to Disney Plus launching in 2019 and what they launched with. Really at the time, The Mandalorian was their crown jewel. It was the main draw to the platform. And that's just an example of when you're focused on attracting new subscribers, when you're in the early stages of growth, hugely popular tentpole series like The Mandalorian as an example, that's going to be really important to draw people in, draw a huge variety of audiences. And so a show like that is going to appeal to many, many audiences. It's going to be part of the conversation. People are going to be talking about it. Everyone is going to want to see Baby Yoda as an example. So in a situation like that, when you're focused on drawing people in, you may be an earlier stage of your growth trajectory. Hugely popular quality, I'm saying quality to mean high demand for a show. That's going to be really important. Conversely, if you are a more mature streamer, you may want to focus on diversifying. We recently did some analysis on HBO Max and Discovery and the differences in their catalogs. So obviously HBO Max has been very focused on critically acclaimed, highly in demand dramas. They've really succeeded in that space, and not so much the focus has not been so much on reality series, documentary series, for example, but of course that's a strength of Discovery. And there was a really great quote about HBO Max, is adding something along the lines of, would adding another hugely popular drama series to HBO Max draw more people in? And the answer is probably not, because they're already a destination for hugely in-demand dramas. A new highly popular drama might make subscribers more happy, may do great things for retention, but at this stage, it's probably not going to draw more people in. Whereas if they were to bring on reality or documentary content, which is something a bit different, obviously a strength for Discovery, that's going to bring in new audiences. So that's a great example of how when you reach a later stage of growth, you may want to focus more on pulling in new audiences, diversifying your content. You may want to make more niche shows that appeal to a specific audience that may very well not have the huge level of demand that a tentpole original would have, but will appeal to a specific segment of audience that will then attract them to sign up. So I think we're almost at time. Just look and see if there are any questions I can touch on quickly. Yeah, so I think that's about time. I'll just mention before I close off. So here we have a 30% discount to Demand 360 Lite for all webinar attendees. As I mentioned, you can get our full report, our full 2021 annual global TV demand report here. You can get also all of our previous reports, all of our white papers, articles we write. They're all available on the platform. And that's in addition to demand data on thousands and thousands of shows in many markets around the world. So there's really some great insights in there. And I just want to thank everyone for tuning in today. And I hope to see everyone again for our next Parrot Analytics Live. Have a nice day. Goodbye.